Clear your desk, Ava. Ethan didn't even look at me when he said it, just kept his eyes on the tablet in his hands like I was a notification he could swipe away, and the room went quiet in that sharp, suffocating way conference rooms do when something ugly is about to happen, while Claire, his girlfriend, sat beside him in a fitted cream blazer, smiling like she'd already won, something I hadn't realized was a competition, and I heard myself ask, "You're serious?" Even though the answer was already sitting in the way he avoided my eyes, and he finally glanced up impatient. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Ava. We're restructuring. Claire will take over operations." And someone at the far end of the table shifted in their chair, pretending to check their phone, pretending this wasn't happening, pretending I hadn't been the one keeping every single one of their planes in the air for the past 10 years. And I felt the weight of every overnight shift, every rerouted flight in a thunderstorm, every decision I made at 3:00 a.m., when no one else picked up the phone, all of it pressed into that one moment where I was being dismissed, like I was nothing more than a temp who overstayed her welcome. And I said, quietly, "She's never run a route," and Claire let out a small laugh. Soft but sharp enough to land. "I'm a fast learner," she said. Crossing her legs like this was a meeting about marketing strategy, not the backbone of a company that moved thousands of people across the country every day. And Ethan sighed like I was the problem, like I was the inconvenience. "You're replaceable, Ava. We all are." And that word replaceable hung in the air heavier than anything else he'd said, because it wasn't just about the job, it was about 10 years of marriage, 10 years of being in his family, 10 years of being useful until I wasn't. And for a second I just looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who used to bring me coffee during late-night shifts, who used to say he couldn't do this without me, and I realized he wasn't even trying to hurt me, which somehow made it worse, because this wasn't anger, this was dismissal, clean and casual, like I had never mattered at all. And if this story speaks to you, only if it truly resonates with something you felt before, take a second to like, subscribe, or leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now, because I'm curious how far this moment travels. My name is Ava Reynolds. I'm 32 years old, and this was the morning my husband fired me from his family's aviation company and replaced me with the woman he'd been quietly moving into my place long before I realized it. The morning everything I thought I understood about my life shifted without warning, and to explain how I ended up sitting in that room, being told I was replaceable, I have to take you back to where it all actually began. Back when the company was barely surviving, back when there were only 6 planes in the fleet and none of them ever left on time, back when Ethan's father looked at me across a cluttered office filled with paper schedules and outdated software and said, "Can you fix this?" And I said yes without really knowing what that would cost me, because I thought I was building something with them, something real, something that would last. And the truth is, from the very beginning, there was one thing about the system I built, one detail I never explained to anyone, not even Ethan, something small enough to ignore until it wasn't. And sitting there in that conference room, listening to them talk about replacing me like I was a line item on a spreadsheet, I realized they still had no idea what I had actually created. I remember the first time I walked into the operations office. It smelled like burnt coffee and overheated plastic, the kind of smell that clings to places that have been running too long without anyone really fixing them. And Richard Walker, Ethan's father, stood by a whiteboard covered in handwritten flight schedules, shaking his head. "We are bleeding money every week," he said, not even looking at me at first, like I was just another interview he had to get through. And I was 22, fresh out of school, standing there in a borrowed blazer that did not quite fit, holding a folder with ideas I was not even sure anyone would take seriously. And when he finally turned to me, his eyes were tired but sharp. "You said you could build something better than this?" And I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, sir. Not just better, smarter. It can predict delays before they happen." And he let out a short laugh, not unkind, just skeptical. "Everyone says that." And from the corner of the room, Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me like I was a curiosity. "Let her try, Dad. Worst case, nothing changes." And that was how it started. Not with trust, not with belief, just with a chance no one expected to matter. And for the first year, I worked out of a cramped server room the size of a walk-in closet, no windows, just the hum of machines, and a folding chair that left marks on the back of my legs after 12-hour shifts. And I remember calling Ethan one night around midnight, my voice echoing slightly in that empty space. I think I figured out how to optimize crew rotations without increasing costs." And he laughed softly. "You are still at the office?" And I said, "I have been here since 6 this morning." And he paused, then said, "You do not have to prove anything to them." And I remember smiling at that, even though he could not see it. I am not proving it to them. I am building something. And at the time, I believed that included him, that we were building something together. But the truth was, even back then, there were lines I did not see, lines drawn quietly between family and not family, between ownership and contribution, and I started noticing it in small ways, the kind you can ignore until they start to form a pattern, like the first time I was asked to step out of a strategy meeting. "This part is for family only," Richard had said, not unkindly, just matter of fact, and Ethan had avoided my eyes as I gathered my notes. "It is just financial stuff," he added quickly, like that made it better, and I nodded, like I understood, like I agreed, even though I was the one who had built the system they were about to make financial decisions around. And later that night I asked him, "Do you think of me as part of the family?" And he hesitated just long enough for me to notice before answering, "Of course I do." And I let it go, because letting things go was easier than questioning them. And then there were the dinners at their house, long polished tables, his mother pouring wine into crystal glasses, saying things like, "Ava keeps busy with her little computer work," with that soft smile that made it sound like a hobby instead of the thing holding their business together. And Ethan would laugh lightly, "She likes solving problems." And I would sit there, hands folded in my lap, listening to them talk about expansion plans, new routes, partnerships, decisions based on numbers I knew better than anyone in that room, and no one ever asked me a single question. And one night his brother leaned over and said, half joking, "So you are like tech support?" And I smiled, something like that, because explaining it would have taken too long, and no one was really listening anyway. And the thing about being underestimated is that it does not happen all at once. It happens in layers, small dismissals stacking on top of each other until they become something solid, something you start to carry without realizing it. And I carried it for years, through system upgrades, through emergency reroutes during storms that grounded other companies, through nights when I slept on that same folding chair because going home would have cost us hours we did not have. And every time something worked, every time a crisis passed without disaster, it became invisible, expected, normal. And slowly, quietly, I became invisible with it. And the only person who ever seemed to notice, at least in the beginning, was Ethan, bringing me coffee, sitting beside me while I explained how the system was evolving, saying things like, "I do not understand half of this, but I know it matters." And I held on to that version of him longer than I should have, because somewhere along the way, that changed too, and I cannot point to the exact moment it did, just like I cannot point to the exact moment I stopped being seen as someone essential and started being treated like someone replaceable. But I remember the first time the system did something no one else expected, something I had not even told them it could do yet, and the look on Richard's face when he realized the company had just avoided a loss that should have cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he turned to Ethan and said, quietly, "How is this even possible?" And Ethan looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was seeing something new, something he had not considered before, and for a second, just a second, I thought maybe everything would change, but it did not, because what they saw in that moment was not me, it was the result, and what they never asked, what they never seemed to care about, was how much of that system depended on something only I controlled, something I had built into it from the very beginning, without ever explaining. And that detail, that one quiet decision, was about to matter more than anything else. The first time everything shifted was not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet moment buried in a Tuesday afternoon when a storm system rolled across the Midwest faster than predicted, and 3 of our aircraft were on intersecting paths that should have caused a cascade of delays, and I was alone in the operations room, screens glowing in that cold blue light, watching the weather radar pulse and shift. And I remember whispering to myself, "Come on, just hold," as my fingers moved across the keyboard, adjusting routes, recalculating fuel margins, rewriting sequences in real time, and somewhere behind me the door opened and Richard walked in, his footsteps stopping mid-stride as he looked up at the main display. "Why are those flights still on schedule?" he asked, his voice low, almost suspicious. And I did not turn around right away. I just said, "Because I rerouted them 12 minutes ago." And he stepped closer, frowning at the screen. "That is not in the system." And I finally looked at him. "It is now." And for the first time since I started, he did not have a follow-up question. Just stood there watching as the lines on the screen adjusted smoothly, flight sliding into new paths like they had always been meant to be there. And after a long moment, he said, quieter than I had ever heard him, "Call Ethan." And when Ethan picked up, I could hear the noise of a restaurant in the background, laughter, glasses clinking, a different world entirely. "What is going on?" he asked, distracted, and Richard took the phone from me. "Get back here." Now, and less than an hour later, Ethan was standing beside me, jacket still on, looking at the screens like he was trying to understand a language he did not speak. "You did this?" he asked, and I nodded. "The system can adapt if you let it." And he looked at me then, really looked, something new in his expression, something closer to respect than I had seen before. "Why did you not show us this earlier?" And I hesitated, just for a second, because no one asked, and the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like something had just been revealed that could not be put back. And over the next few weeks, things changed in small, noticeable ways. I was invited into meetings I had never been part of before, given a seat at the table instead of a summary afterward, and the first time I walked into one of those rooms and saw my name printed on an agenda, I felt something shift inside me, something like recognition, like maybe I had finally crossed whatever invisible line had been keeping me on the outside. And during one meeting, Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. "Explain how the predictive routing works." And all eyes turned to me, and I spoke, calmly, walking them through models, probabilities, contingencies, and for the first time, no one interrupted, no one dismissed it as technical noise. And when I finished, there was a pause, and then a nod from Richard, slow but deliberate. "Good," he said, and it was just one word. But it landed heavier than any compliment I had ever received, and Ethan started coming by more often after that, standing behind my chair, asking questions. "How does it decide which route to prioritize? What happens if two systems conflict?" And I would explain, pointing at the screen, watching as he tried to follow. And one evening he brought me coffee again, setting it down beside my keyboard. "You should have told me how much you were doing," he said. And I smiled slightly. "You never asked," and he shook his head, almost amused. "That is not fair." And I looked at him then. Neither was being invisible, and he did not have an answer for that. Just stood there for a moment before changing the subject. But not everything shifted in the same direction, because as I was being pulled closer into the core of the business, something else was happening quietly, almost out of sight. At a family dinner a week later, his mother smiled that same polite smile and said, "It is nice that Ava is being included more, like it was a favor, like it was temporary." And his brother leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink. "Just do not forget who actually owns the company." And Ethan laughed lightly, not correcting him, not saying anything at all. And I felt that old familiar weight settle back in, that reminder that no matter how essential I became to the system, there were still lines I was not allowed to cross. And later that night, as I sat alone in the operations room, watching the system run through another cycle, smooth and quiet, I opened a section of the code I had not touched in months, a small, deeply embedded function that controlled something no one else even knew existed, and I stared at it for a long moment before making a tiny adjustment, barely noticeable, the kind of change that does not matter until it does. And as I saved it, the screen flickered for just a second, a subtle shift in the background processes, and I leaned back in my chair, listening to the steady hum of the servers, knowing without fully admitting it to myself that something had just been set in motion, something that would not show up immediately, something that would wait, quiet and patient, until the moment it was needed. It did not happen all at once. That would have been easier to see, easier to fight. Instead, it started with small shifts in tone, in language, the kind of subtle changes that make you question your own memory before you question anyone else. Like the first time Claire walked into the operations room unannounced, heels clicking too sharply against the floor, looking around like she was already in charge. "I just want to understand what you do here," she said, smiling in that practiced way that never quite reached her eyes. And I gestured toward the screens. "It is not one thing, it is a system." And she nodded slowly. "Right. but simplify it for me." And something in her voice made it clear she was not asking to learn. She was asking to reduce it, to make it smaller, manageable, something she could step into without acknowledging what it actually was. And later that week, I overheard her in the hallway. Her voice low, but not low enough. "It is overly complicated, honestly. It could be streamlined if we brought in the right consultants." And Ethan responded, "That is what I have been thinking too." And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, the words settling into something heavier than disagreement, something closer to dismissal. And when I stepped into the room, both of them went quiet for just a beat too long. "We were just talking about scalability," Claire said smoothly, and I nodded. "Of course you were," because I had learned by then that calling it out directly never worked. It only made you look defensive, and over the next few weeks the conversations shifted further away from me. Decisions made in meetings I was no longer invited to, updates passed down instead of discussed. And when I asked Ethan about it one night, standing in our kitchen with the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, why was I not included in the last operations review? He barely looked up from his phone. "We are just exploring options," he said, casual, dismissive. And I felt something tighten in my chest. Options for what? And he sighed, like I was making this harder than it needed to be. "For scaling the business, Ava. You built something great, but it is not sustainable at this level." And I stared at him. Not sustainable? And he finally looked up, meeting my eyes for a second before looking away again. "It depends too much on you." And that was the first time I heard it said out loud, not as a strength, but as a problem. And I said quietly, "That was the point." And he shook his head slightly. "No, the point is to build something that does not rely on one person." And I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far from the reality of what they had asked me to do in the beginning. And the next morning I walked into the office and saw a group of people I did not recognize, sitting in the conference room, laptops open, diagrams on the screen that looked like simplified versions of my system, stripped down, flattened, and Claire stood at the front of the room presenting. "We have identified several inefficiencies in the current routing structure," she said, and I felt my hands go still at my sides. "Inefficiencies?" I repeated, stepping closer, and she turned, smiling again. "Ava, perfect timing. We are just discussing how to modernize operations." And I looked at the screen, at the diagrams that misrepresented what I had built, that removed the very layers that made it work, and I said, "This will not hold under real conditions." And one of the consultants glanced at me, then back at Claire. "We have implemented similar models across multiple industries," he said, polite but dismissive. And Ethan spoke from the head of the table. "We are not saying your system does not work, Ava. We are saying it is time to evolve." And the word evolve hung there, heavy with implication. And I realized then that the narrative had already been written, that somewhere in conversations I had not been part of, the story had shifted from me being essential to me being outdated. And I said carefully, "You are replacing something you do not fully understand." And Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "We understand enough." And that was when it hit me, not as anger, not even as shock, but as a quiet, hollow realization that they had already decided who I was in this story, and it was not the person who built the system. It was the obstacle standing in the way of whatever came next. And over the following days, the changes accelerated, access permissions adjusted, responsibilities reassigned, small pieces of control slipping away one at a time. And every time I questioned it, there was an explanation, reasonable on the surface. Just temporary. Just for testing. Just to see how it performs. And I nodded each time, because arguing would have meant admitting what I was starting to understand, that this was not about improvement, it was about replacement. And the final moment came quietly, almost anticlimactic, when I tried to log into the core system one morning, and the screen paused longer than usual before displaying a message I had never seen before, access restricted, and for a second, I just stared at it, my reflection faint in the dark screen, and then I heard Claire's voice behind me, light, almost cheerful. We made a few adjustments to permissions, and I turned slowly. "Without telling me?" And she shrugged slightly. "We did not think it would be an issue." And across the room, Ethan stood watching, not intervening, not correcting, just observing. And in that moment, everything I had built, everything I had believed about my place in that company, in that family, collapsed into something painfully simple. They had already moved on without me. They just had not said it out loud yet. And as I stood there, staring at a system I no longer had full access to, I realized that whatever was coming next was not going to be a discussion, it was going to be an ending. I did not leave that day, not immediately, because walking away would have made it real in a way I was not ready to face. So instead I tried to fix it the way I had fixed everything else for the past 10 years, quietly, methodically, believing that if I just explained it clearly enough, if I just showed them what they were missing, something would shift back into place. And that night I called Ethan 3 times before he finally answered, the line clicking open with a distracted, "I am in the middle of something," and I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "We need to talk about what is happening at the office." And there was a pause, then a sigh. "Ava, not tonight," and I pressed. "You locked me out of the core system," and he responded quickly, almost rehearsed. "It is temporary. Claire is overseeing the transition," and I felt the word transition settle in my chest, heavy and final. Transition to what? And he did not answer right away, just said, "You are overreacting," before ending the call, and I stood there in the dark kitchen, the screen of my phone dimming in my hand, realizing that the conversation I thought we were going to have was not one he was willing to be part of anymore. And the next morning I sent an email to Richard, carefully written, professional, outlining the risks of what they were implementing, attaching data, projections, real scenarios that showed exactly where and how the system would fail without the layers they were removing. And I stared at the sent message for a long moment before closing my laptop, telling myself he would respond, that he had to respond, because he had seen what the system could do, because he understood what was at stake. But hours passed, then the entire day, and there was nothing, no reply, no acknowledgement, just silence. And by evening, I sent another message, shorter this time, "Please confirm you received my earlier email," and still nothing. And I began to understand that this was not oversight, this was choice. And later that week I found a printed memo on my desk, unsigned but clearly internal, detailing a phased transition of operational control. My name mentioned only once under a section labeled Legacy System, and I read that line 3 times before setting the paper down, my fingers still, my mind oddly quiet, like something inside me had stopped resisting, and was just observing now. And I walked down the hallway to the conference room where Claire was speaking again, her voice confident, steady. "We have already reduced dependency on single-point decision-making," she said, and I stepped inside. "By removing the person who built the system," I added, and a few heads turned, a few people avoided my eyes, and Claire smiled, controlled. "By modernizing the structure," she corrected, and I looked at Ethan. "You know this is not going to work." And for a second, there was something in his expression, something like hesitation, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that same distant calm. "We are moving forward," he said. And the room seemed to tilt slightly, not physically, but in that quiet, internal way where you realize the ground you were standing on is no longer there. And I nodded once, because there was nothing else to say in that moment. And over the next few days, I kept trying. Texts that went unanswered. "Can we talk? This is bigger than you think." Messages left unread, calls that rang until voicemail picked up, emails that disappeared into silence, and each attempt felt smaller than the last, like I was reaching into something that had already closed. And the final attempt came on a Sunday evening, sitting alone in the operations room, the hum of the servers louder than usual, or maybe I was just noticing it more, and I dialed Ethan again, not expecting him to answer, but he did. His voice low, distant. "What is it?" And I said, softer this time, "Just tell me the truth. Is this about the company or is this about her?" And there was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then he said, "It is about what is best for the future." And I closed my eyes for a second, letting that answer settle, because it was not really an answer at all. It was a deflection, a carefully chosen phrase that avoided everything that actually mattered. And I whispered, almost to myself, "You did not even try to fix this." And he did not respond, just said, "I have to go," before the line went dead. And I sat there for a long time after that, phone still in my hand, the screens in front of me running quietly, efficiently, the system doing exactly what it had always done. And for the first time in 10 years, I did not feel connected to it, did not feel responsible for it, just felt separate, like I was already on the outside looking in. And the strangest part was not the anger or the hurt, it was the silence, the absence of any real response from the people who had once relied on me for everything. And in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet understanding that whatever came next, I would be facing it alone. The next few days did not explode into chaos the way I once imagined they might. There was no dramatic collapse, no immediate crisis, just a quiet unraveling that felt almost worse, because it proved how easily everything could continue without me, at least on the surface. And that was the part that hurt the most. Not the loss of the job, not even the betrayal, but the realization that my absence did not create the immediate void I thought it would, that the system kept running, the screen still glowing, the flights still moving across the map as if nothing had changed. And I sat in my apartment that first night after being fully removed from operations, the silence pressing in around me. My laptop closed on the table in front of me for the first time in years before midnight, and I did not know what to do with that space, that emptiness where constant urgency used to live. And I remember picking up my phone, scrolling through old messages between Ethan and me, reading things like, "We could not have done this without you," and "You saved us today." And I stared at those words like they belonged to someone else's life, someone else's relationship, and I whispered, "When did this change?" Even though there was no one there to answer, and the next morning I drove past the office without planning to, just out of habit, my hands turning the wheel before my mind caught up, and I slowed down as the building came into view, the glass reflecting the early light, people already inside, moving through routines I had once been part of, and I pulled into the parking lot, sitting there for a long moment, watching as Claire walked in through the front doors, her posture straight, confident, like she had always belonged there, and I felt something sharp and quiet settle in my chest, not anger this time, not even sadness exactly, just a kind of hollow recognition that I had been replaced not just in function but in presence. And before I realized what I was doing, I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my steps slow, uncertain, until I reached the glass doors and saw my reflection staring back at me. And for a second, I did not recognize the person looking back, someone who looked tired, smaller somehow, like parts of her had been stripped away, and when I tried my badge out of instinct, the red light blinked immediately. Access denied, and the sound of it was louder than it should have been, sharp in the quiet morning air, and I heard a voice behind me, "You should not be here." And I turned to see one of the security staff, someone who used to nod at me every morning, now standing a few feet away, unsure, uncomfortable, and I managed a small nod. "I know," I said, and he hesitated before adding, softer, "They updated the list yesterday." And I smiled slightly, not at him, just at the situation. Of course they did. And I walked back to my car without looking back again, and that was the moment it became real in a way it had not been before, not in a meeting room, not in a conversation, but in that simple, final denial of entry. And later that afternoon, I received a formal email from the company. Subject line: termination confirmation. The language cold, precise, outlining final compensation, return of company property, access revocation already completed. And I read it once, then again, each word settling into something final, something that could not be undone or explained away. And I closed the laptop slowly, my hands resting on the table as the room fell quiet again. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing demanding my attention. No alerts, no decisions waiting to be made, no system depending on me. And I did not know who I was without that, without the constant pressure, the constant responsibility. And I sat there until the light outside shifted from afternoon to evening, the shadows stretching across the floor. And at some point I realized I had not spoken out loud all day, not to anyone, and the silence felt heavier than any argument ever had. And I finally said, just to hear something, "Okay," the words small, almost lost in the room, but it was enough, because in that quiet, in that emptiness, there was something else too, something I had not noticed at first, a slight distance from the pain, a space opening where something new could begin, not immediately, not easily, but undeniably there, like the first sign of a shift after a long, steady decline. And I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, realizing that for the first time in years, nothing was holding me in place anymore, And that realization, as quiet as it was, carried the first hint that this was not just an ending, it was the beginning of something else. The first thing I did was not something dramatic or impressive. There was no big announcement, no clear plan, just a quiet decision one morning to get up at 6 again instead of lying there staring at the ceiling, and I made coffee the same way I used to before early shifts, measuring it out carefully, listening to the slow drip fill the glass pot, and for a moment it felt like muscle memory guiding me back into a version of myself I had almost forgotten, and I opened my laptop, not to check alerts or flight schedules, but to open a blank document, the screen bright and empty, and I just sat there for a minute before typing the first line. Not code, not a report, just a simple list of what I knew how to do, and it felt strangely difficult, like translating something I had always done instinctively into words someone else could understand. And later that day, I called an old contact, Marcus Hill, someone I had worked with years ago during a routing crisis, when his logistics firm almost lost a major contract. And when he picked up, his voice carried that same steady tone I remembered. "Ava, it has been a while." And I said, "I need to ask you something." And he paused, then laughed softly. "That sounds serious." And I told him, "Not everything, not the full story, just enough. I am not with Walker Aviation anymore." And there was a brief silence on the line before he said, "Their loss," so simply, so certain, that it caught me off guard, and I asked, "Do you know anyone who needs help with operational systems?" And he did not hesitate. "I might." And that was how it started, not with confidence, not with certainty, just with one conversation that did not end in dismissal. And the next week, I found myself sitting across from a small team in a modest office space, nothing like the glass conference rooms I had gotten used to. The walls plain, the chairs slightly mismatched, and a woman named Elena looked at me across the table, her expression direct. "We are losing time and money on every route we manage," she said, sliding a set of printed reports toward me, and I flipped through them, scanning quickly, recognizing patterns almost immediately. "Your system is reactive," I said, and she nodded. "We know that," and I looked up, meeting her eyes. "It does not have to be," and there was a moment, brief but real, where something shifted in the room, not because I had proven anything yet, but because I was being heard. And over the next few days, I worked from my apartment again, building small models, testing scenarios, not at the scale I once had, not yet, but enough to see that the same instincts, the same patterns still held. And one evening Elena called, her voice carrying a different energy. "Whatever you changed, it worked." And I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen in front of me. "It is just the beginning," I said, and she laughed lightly. "Then I want to see what the rest looks like." And I realized then that this was something I had not felt in a long time. Not just usefulness, but ownership, not just contributing to someone else's system, but building something that was entirely mine. And the days started to take on a rhythm again. Early mornings, long hours, but this time, without the constant weight of needing approval, without the quiet pressure of fitting into a space that had never fully accepted me. And one afternoon, Marcus called again. "I mentioned your name to someone else," he said, and I closed my laptop slowly, listening. "A larger operation, more complex, they are struggling," and I felt a familiar spark, something sharp and focused. "Send me the details," I said, and after we hung up, I sat there for a moment, the room quiet around me, realizing that for the first time since everything fell apart, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I could build next. And somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a quiet awareness, not loud, not urgent, just steady, that the system I had created, the knowledge I carried, the things they had dismissed so easily, were not gone. They had simply moved with me. And as I opened a new file and began outlining something larger than anything I had attempted on my own before, I understood that what I was starting now was not just recovery, it was something that would grow beyond anything they had ever imagined, something that would not need their validation to exist. And the thought settled in quietly, but firmly, that this was only the beginning. It did not feel like a turning point at first. There was no single moment where everything suddenly became clear. It was built the same way everything else in my life had been built, slowly, deliberately, through small decisions that stacked into something larger. And 3 months later, I found myself standing in a space that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and new carpet. A converted office on the second floor of a brick building downtown, sunlight cutting across the floor in long, clean lines. And for a second, I just stood there with the key in my hand, letting it sink in. Because this was mine, not borrowed, not assigned, not something I had to earn permission to be part of. And Elena walked in behind me, setting a stack of folders on the table. "So this is it?" she asked, looking around, and I nodded. "This is where we build it." And she smiled, not the polite kind I had grown used to, but something real. "Then let us make it count." And over the next few weeks, that empty room filled with screens, cables, whiteboards covered in diagrams that no one asked me to simplify, because the people in that room wanted to understand, not reduce. And one afternoon, Marcus stopped by, leaning against the doorway as he looked at the setup. "You built all this in 3 months?" he asked, and I shrugged slightly. I had a head start. And he laughed, shaking his head. "They really let you walk away." And I met his eyes for a second. They did not think I was walking away with anything, and that was the difference now, the quiet shift in how I saw myself, not as someone who had lost something, but as someone who had taken everything that mattered with her. And it showed in the way I moved through the room, in the way I spoke when new clients sat across from me, not explaining my value, not proving it, just outlining what I could build, and watching as they leaned in, listening, because confidence does not come from being told you matter, it comes from knowing it without needing confirmation. And one morning, Elena handed me a small box, sliding it across the desk with a slight smile. "You might need this," she said, and I opened it to find a simple metal nameplate. Nothing extravagant, just clean, understated. The words engraved in black, Ava Reynolds, Chief Systems Architect, and I ran my fingers lightly over the letters, the weight of it settling in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. And I placed it on the edge of the desk, aligning it carefully. And for a moment, I just looked at it, not because of the title, but because it was chosen, not given by someone else, not limited by someone else's perception. And later that day, during a meeting with a new client, a man in his 50s leaned back in his chair after I finished explaining the system. "And you are the one who designed all of this?" he asked, and I nodded. "Yes." And he studied me for a second before saying, "Then I think we are in the right place." And there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, just a straightforward acknowledgement that felt more solid than any approval I had ever chased before. And the work grew quickly after that, one project leading to another, each one more complex, more demanding, and I found myself in that familiar rhythm again. Long hours, focused attention, but this time without the underlying strain of needing to justify my presence. And one evening, as the office quieted and the city lights flickered on outside the window, Elena leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. And I paused, considering the question, not because I was unsure, but because it felt distant now, like something from a different version of my life. "No," I said finally, and she nodded, like she already knew the answer. And as she walked out, I turned back to the screen in front of me, lines of code and data flowing in patterns I understood instinctively. And for a moment I allowed myself to sit with the quiet certainty that this was mine, all of it, built without permission, without limitation. And then my phone buzzed on the desk, the sound cutting through the stillness, and I glanced down, expecting another client message, another update. But the name on the screen stopped me. Ethan. And for a second I just stared at it, the past and present colliding in that small, unexpected moment, and I let it ring once, twice, before picking it up, the connection clicking open as I said, calmly, "Hello," and on the other end there was a pause, longer than it should have been, before his voice came through, quieter than I remembered. "Ava, we need to talk," and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes drifting to the nameplate on my desk, then back to the window where the city stretched out beyond the glass, and something inside me settled into place. Because whatever this call was about, it was not going to change who I had become, and I said, evenly, "What is it?" knowing, without needing him to say it yet, that the timeline I had left behind was finally catching up to me. The silence on the line stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like he was choosing his words carefully for the first time in a long time. and I could hear something faint in the background on his end, not the usual restaurant noise or office chatter, something sharper, more urgent, voices overlapping, a distant announcement echoing through what sounded like a large, open space, and I said again, a little slower this time, "What is it?" And he exhaled, the sound unsteady. "There is a situation." And I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "There was always a situation," I replied, and there was a pause, then his voice dropped lower. "This is different," and I did not respond right away. Just let the silence sit between us until he continued, "We are at the operations center." And that detail landed immediately, sharp and precise, because he never said we like that unless it was serious, unless it involved more than just him and Claire. And I asked, "What happened?" And I heard him shift, like he was stepping away from something or someone. "Flights are delayed. Multiple routes are conflicting. The system is not stabilizing." And I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in frustration, not even in satisfaction, just in recognition, because I knew exactly what that meant, not the surface issue, but the layers underneath it, the way small inconsistencies could cascade into something much larger if the system was not reading them correctly. And I said evenly, "And Claire?" And he hesitated, just enough. "She is trying," he said, and I could almost see it, the screens, the tension, the way she would be moving between stations without understanding what she was looking at. And I opened my eyes again, staring out at the city lights. "Trying is not enough," I said quietly, and he did not argue with that, just said, "We need you to come in." And the words hung there, heavier than anything else he had said, not because of what they meant for the company, but because of what they revealed about everything that had happened before. And I let a few seconds pass before answering, "I do not work there anymore." And there was a flicker of something in his tone now, something closer to urgency. "Ava, this is not about that." And I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but because it was exactly about that. Everything about it was about that. And I said, "It is always about that." And in the background I heard another voice, sharper, cutting through the noise. "Ethan, we need a decision now." And he turned away from the phone for a moment, his voice muffled as he responded to someone else. And I listened, not trying to make out the words, just recognizing the rhythm, the pressure building in a system that was no longer responding the way they expected it to. And when he came back on the line, his voice was tighter, more controlled. "Can you at least come here so we can talk?" And I considered that for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I was measuring something internally, not the situation itself, but my place in it now. And finally I said, "Where exactly are you?" And he answered immediately, "Main operations floor." And I nodded to myself, even though he could not see it. "I will be there," and I ended the call before he could say anything else. And for a second, I just sat there, the room around me quiet again, my reflection faint in the dark window. And I reached for my coat, moving slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not hesitating, just stepping into a moment I had already anticipated in ways I had not fully acknowledged until now. And the drive across the city felt shorter than usual, the streets lit by scattered headlights, and the steady glow of traffic signals. And when I pulled into the familiar parking lot, the building looked the same as it always had, glass and steel reflecting the night. But something about it felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. And as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, I could see movement inside, people shifting quickly, the energy of the place sharper, more chaotic than the controlled environment I remembered. And when the doors opened this time, no one stopped me, no badge required, just a quick glance from security and a nod that felt more like recognition than permission. And I walked down the hallway, the sound of overlapping voices growing louder with each step, until I reached the operations floor. And for a moment, I just stood at the edge of it, taking in the scene, screens filled with flashing alerts, lines crossing in ways they should not, people moving between stations with a kind of urgency that bordered on confusion. And Ethan stood near the center, his posture tense, his focus split between multiple conversations, and Claire was at one of the terminals. Her movements quick but uncertain, her voice raised slightly as she spoke to someone beside her. "Why is this not updating?" And no one answered her directly. And I stepped forward then, my presence not immediately noticed, just another figure entering a space already too full. and I watched for a second longer, not intervening yet, not speaking, just observing the system I had built reacting in ways I had predicted long before any of this happened. And then Ethan turned, his eyes finding mine across the room, and something shifted in his expression, something that had not been there before. Not dismissal, not confidence, something closer to realization. And he started toward me, stopping just a few feet away, his voice lower now, almost careful. "Ava," and I met his gaze, steady, calm, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because whatever was about to be said next, whatever truth was about to surface in that room, it was not something that could be taken back once it was out. The room did not go quiet when he said my name, but something shifted, subtle, like the air itself had changed direction, and I watched him for a moment before answering, not rushing, not filling the space, just letting him stand there with the weight of everything he had not said yet. And finally I spoke. "You said there was a situation," and he nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "The system is failing." And I tilted my head slightly, glancing past him at the screens where routes overlapped in ways they should not, alerts blinking in uneven patterns. "No," I said calmly. "The system is responding." And he frowned, confusion flashing across his face. Responding to what? And I stepped past him then, moving toward the nearest terminal, my eyes scanning the data, the patterns exactly as I remembered, just slightly misaligned, like a machine missing one critical instruction. And Claire turned toward me, her voice sharp, defensive. "We do not need commentary right now." And I met her gaze briefly before looking back at the screen. "You removed the adaptive layers," I said, more to the room than to her, and one of the analysts nearby nodded hesitantly. "We simplified the routing logic," he said, like he was repeating something he had been told, and I pressed a few keys, pulling up a deeper layer of the system, the part they had overlooked. "You did not simplify it," I replied. "You stripped out the only part that lets it think ahead." And Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Then fix it." And I paused, my hands still over the keyboard, not because I could not, but because of what that request meant. And I looked at him, really looked this time. "You already decided I was the problem," I said, and he did not deny it, just said, "We made a mistake." And the words landed differently than anything he had said before, not defensive, not dismissive, just late. And behind him I saw Richard for the first time, standing near the back of the room, his expression harder to read than anyone else's. And he spoke then, his voice steady but carrying across the noise. "Explain it." And I turned slightly toward him. "The system you are using now reacts to problems after they appear," I said, keeping my tone even. "The one I built predicts them before they happen." And he narrowed his eyes slightly. "We know that," and I shook my head once. "No, you know the result, not the structure." And I brought up another layer on the screen, something they had not seen before. A network of conditional pathways running beneath the visible interface. And there was a small shift in the room as people leaned in, noticing for the first time that what they thought was the system was only part of it. And Ethan stepped closer to the screen, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "Why is this not in the documentation?" And I answered simply, "Because no one asked for it." And Claire crossed her arms, her posture tightening. "So you are saying we cannot run operations without you?" And I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not even with judgment, just with a kind of clarity that had taken me too long to reach. "I am saying you removed the only part of the system that does not fail under pressure." And the room went quieter then, not completely silent, but enough that the weight of that statement settled in, and Richard stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Can it be restored?" he asked. And I exhaled slowly, my eyes moving over the code, the architecture still there, just disconnected. "Parts of it," I said, and Ethan's voice came quickly. "Then do it." And I shook my head slightly, not abruptly, just enough to be clear. "It is not that simple." And he looked at me, frustration and something else mixing in his expression. "It was simple enough when you built it." And I met his gaze steady. "It was never simple," I said, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The distance between us, filled with everything that had been ignored, dismissed, and finally understood too late. And then I added quietly, "You just never had to see that part." And behind him, one of the analysts spoke up, his voice uncertain. We are losing coordination on the west routes. And another voice followed. East Coast delays are stacking. And the noise began to rise again, but differently now. Not controlled urgency, but something closer to realization. And Ethan ran a hand through his hair, turning back to me. Tell me what we need to do. And I looked at the screen one more time. At the system I had built. The layers they had never fully understood. The structure that had held everything together quietly for years. And then I looked back at him, my voice calm, precise. You cannot fix this by replacing one part, I said, and his expression shifted, something tightening. Then what? And I held his gaze for just a second longer before answering. Because the part you removed was not a function, I said, letting the words land exactly as they needed to. It was the foundation. And the meaning of that settled across the room in a way that no alert or flashing screen could match. And for the first time since I walked in, no one moved, no one spoke, because they were all understanding the same thing at the same time, that what was breaking in front of them was not just a system, it was the entire structure they had built their operations on, and that realization, quiet but undeniable, was the moment everything changed. No one spoke for a moment after that, not because they did not have something to say, but because they were all recalculating at the same time, trying to fit this new understanding into the version of reality they had been operating under. And it did not fit, not cleanly, not comfortably, and I could see it in the way people avoided looking directly at me, the way their attention shifted between the screens and Ethan and Richard, like they were waiting for someone else to define what this meant. And finally Richard stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying something heavier now. If the foundation is gone, then we rebuild it. And I met his gaze, calm. You cannot rebuild it overnight. And he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then we stabilize what we can. And for a second it almost sounded like the old version of him, the one who understood the weight of decisions. But then he added, with or without you, and that was the line, quiet but clear. And I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not even disappointment anymore, just clarity. And I said, without me is already your decision. And Ethan shifted beside him, his voice lower now, more controlled. That decision can change. And I looked at him, really looked this time, not at the tension in his posture or the urgency in his tone, but at the space between who he had been and who he had become. Decisions like that do not change when it is convenient, I said, and he exhaled sharply, frustration flickering through his expression. This is not about convenience. And I tilted my head slightly. Then what is it about? And he hesitated just for a second before answering, fixing what we broke. And the honesty in that landed differently. But it did not move me the way it might have before, because it came after everything else, after the dismissal, after the silence, after the deliberate removal of everything I had built. And behind him, Claire stepped forward, her voice tighter now, less polished than before. You are making this sound like we cannot function without you. And I turned to her, my tone even. You are functioning, I said, glancing briefly at the screens where alerts continued to stack in uneven patterns, just not in a way that holds under pressure. And she crossed her arms, defensive. That is temporary, and I nodded slightly. So was my position. And the words landed quietly but directly, and for a moment she did not respond, her confidence slipping just enough to be visible, and one of the analysts spoke up from the side, his voice uncertain. We are still losing coordination across multiple routes. And another added, the system is not syncing adjustments fast enough. And Ethan turned back to me, his voice more urgent now. Tell us what we need to do. And I paused, not because I did not know, but because I was deciding how much of myself I was willing to place back into this space. And I said carefully, you need to restore the predictive layer. And Richard stepped closer. Then do it. And I shook my head slightly. It does not work like that. And his eyes narrowed. You built it. And I held his gaze steady. I maintained it, I said. Every day, every adjustment, every change in conditions. It was not a static system. And the weight of that seemed to settle differently this time, because it was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time around them. And Ethan's voice softened, just slightly. Ava, he said. And there was something in it now that had not been there before. Not authority, not dismissal, something closer to recognition. We need your help. And I let that sit for a moment before answering. You needed it before. And the room went quieter again. Not completely, but enough that the distinction mattered, and I added calmly, "Now you need to decide what that actually means." And he frowned slightly. "What are you asking for?" And I did not answer immediately, because it was not about listing demands or negotiating terms in that moment. It was about something much simpler and much harder at the same time. And finally I said, "I am not asking for anything," and he blinked, caught off guard. "Then what is this?" And I looked around the room once, at the people, the systems, the structure that had once defined my place in the world, and then back at him. "This is me deciding what I am willing to give," and there was a pause. Longer this time, because that was not a framework they were used to operating within, not with me, and Richard spoke again, his tone more measured now. "And what are you willing to give?" And I exhaled slowly, the answer already clear in my mind long before he asked the question. "Clarity," I said, "not control." And Ethan's expression tightened slightly. "That is not enough." And I met his gaze, steady. "It is more than you had 5 minutes ago." And the truth of that settled into the room in a way that no one could argue with, and for the first time since I walked in, I was no longer reacting to the situation. I was defining it, and that shift, quiet but undeniable, changed the way everyone in the room looked at me, not as someone they had removed, not as someone they could simply reinstate, but as someone who now stood outside of their structure entirely, and that realization lingered there, unresolved, stretching into something that had not yet fully taken shape. The system did not collapse that night, not completely, because systems like that rarely do. They fracture first, they bend, they struggle to hold together under pressure until something either stabilizes or gives way, and what I gave them was enough to stabilize. Nothing more. Just clarity where there had been confusion, direction where there had been noise, and I stepped back after that, not reclaiming my place, not taking control again, just watching as they followed the path I outlined, slower than before, less efficient, but functioning. And by the time the alerts began to fade and the overlapping routes started to separate into something recognizable again, the room had shifted, not just in energy, but in understanding. And no one said thank you, not directly, but they did not need to, because the silence that followed was different now, heavier, more aware. And Ethan stood a few feet away, looking at the screens, then at me, like he was trying to bridge a distance he had only just realized existed. "We could fix this," he said quietly, and I knew he was not just talking about the system, and I shook my head, not harshly, just simply, "You can fix what you have now," I said, "but not what you already chose to let go." And he did not argue with that, did not push, just nodded once, like he finally understood something that had been there all along. And Richard approached a moment later, his expression measured, his voice steady. "You built something we did not fully understand," he said, and I met his gaze. "That was never the problem." And he held that for a second before adding, "No, it was not." And there was something in that acknowledgement that felt complete, not like an apology, not like regret, just recognition. And for me, that was enough. Not because it repaired anything, but because it closed something that had been left open for too long. And I stepped away after that, not dramatically, not with final words or gestures, just a quiet turn toward the exit, leaving behind the system, the people, the version of my life that had defined me for so many years. And as I walked out of the building, the night air felt cooler than I expected, the city quieter in that late hour, and I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking back at the glass structure where the lights still burned on multiple floors, knowing they would keep working through the night, adjusting, compensating, learning in ways they had never needed to before. And I did not feel anger. Not anymore, just a kind of distance that allowed me to see everything more clearly than I ever had while I was inside it. And the next morning I was back in my own office, sunlight cutting across the desk, the quiet hum of my own system running steadily, and Elena looked up as I walked in. "How did it go?" she asked, and I set my bag down, taking a moment before answering. "It ended," and she studied me for a second, then nodded, like that was enough, and I sat down at my desk, my eyes resting briefly on the nameplate in front of me. Ava Reynolds, Chief Systems Architect, the metal catching the light in a way that felt steady, grounded, real. And I reached out, adjusting it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the desk. A small, deliberate movement. And in that moment, I understood something I had not been able to put into words before, that what we build matters, but who we become in the process matters more. Because systems can be replicated, roles can be replaced, but the part of you that learns, adapts, and chooses not to disappear when you are no longer recognized, that is the part no one can take from you. And if you are listening to this and you feel like you have been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel smaller than what you know you are capable of, I want you to understand something clearly. Your value does not decrease because someone else fails to see it, and your intuition, that quiet voice that tells you when something is off, when something is shifting in ways you cannot yet explain, that is not something to ignore. It is something to trust, because whether you call it instinct, experience, or something deeper, something placed in you by God or the universe, it is there to guide you when everything else becomes uncertain. And one of the most important things I learned is this: protect your work, protect your knowledge, but most importantly, protect your sense of self. Because once you allow someone else to define your worth, you start building your life on something that can be taken away at any moment. And healing does not come from proving them wrong. It comes from choosing not to need their validation at all. And if you are in a place where you are rebuilding, starting over, or simply trying to find your footing again, know that you are not behind, you are not lost. You are in the process of becoming someone who will not settle for less than what you deserve. And that takes time, patience, and a kind of strength that does not always look loud or obvious, but it is there, growing quietly, just like everything that truly lasts. And I want to thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing these moments to be shared, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for each other is simply not feel alone in what we have experienced. And my name is Ava Reynolds. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave you with is this: never build your identity in a place where your value is conditional. And as you move forward from here, I hope you carry that with you, not as a warning, but as a reminder of what you are capable of creating when you finally stand on your own foundation. And if this story stayed with you, there are more stories waiting for you. Stories that explore what it means to lose, to rebuild, and to find yourself again in ways you never expected. And you might find that the next one speaks to a part of you that is still finding its voice. So take your time, stay curious, and I will see you in the next story.